Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're going to be talking about the 10, or actually 11 again, worst spells in Baldur's Gate 3. So I recently covered the 10 best spells in the game, so of course check that video out if you haven't seen it yet. And it only makes sense to talk about the spells that are the lowest of the low, even weaker than the other spells I rated in D tier when I did my comprehensive ratings of all of the spells. I'm going to talk about which of these spells in the game are the worst, why they're weaker than other spells, and I've also included a few notes on how they could be fixed to be a little more interesting or powerful if you're a modder looking to make changes or just curious about what could be done to make the balance make a little bit more sense. Now obviously, even more than the best spells tier list, it's important to remember this list is really just for fun. If you're enjoying casting any of these spells, then by all means keep doing it. I personally have had a lot of fun and plenty of great moments with many of the spells on this list. Just because they're not as mechanically optimal doesn't mean they can't be fun to cast. Optimizing your spell slots and action economy is one way to have fun with the game, but definitely not the only way. And some of these spells can still do really cool things, even though they're a little weaker than other options. Also, even the worst spells in the game can still be good if you construct your party or strategy around them. So it's important to keep that in mind as we go through, but these spells do tend to be quite a lot weaker than other options available. Before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Michael Tromer for the $10 donation, Tarantula for the $10 and $5, so $15, Terry Ernest for the incredibly generous $100 donation, and Wanda Husbando for the £5. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate your support. It really means so much to me. Alright, let's talk bad spells. Now, in my top 10 spells video, I already talked about what I mean when I say best spells, so if you want to know what I mean when I say worst spells, just watch that video and reverse the criteria. We're just going to jump right in with our honorable mention, and that is Stoneskin. Stoneskin, I think, is a really interesting case, and that's why I wanted to bring it up for this spell list, because it's actually not that bad a spell. The effect of Stoneskin is relatively powerful, resistance is really good, and although it is very, very expensive to use, because it costs a level 4 spell slot and takes your concentration for the entire day in order to use it, it can still be pretty good. But there's an important thing about Stoneskin, and the reason I wanted to mention it for this list is that the context of Baldur's Gate 3 matters. You can't just look at these spells completely in a vacuum and decide whether they're good or not based just on the text of the spell. You have to look at the game that they're actually in. And in Baldur's Gate 3, Stoneskin is a lot worse than it is in as a tabletop equivalent spell. Because in Baldur's Gate 3, there are so many very, very easy sources of damage resistance. Stoneskin gives you resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage for the entire day at the cost of your concentration. You can also cast it on an ally or something. So it can be pretty good for a druid trying to maintain their wild shape forms for longer, or to keep a summon alive, or to keep a squishy ally alive, as long as you don't drop concentration. The problem is that it just gives damage resistance, and in Baldur's Gate 3 there's a million ways to get that. The buff on heal items give your whole party Blade Ward effectively for free. Warding Bond works extremely well in Baldur's Gate 3 with very few downsides if you put it on the right characters, and obviously even fewer if you use camp casting in order to have Warding Bond on your whole party without using an active character. So there's just a lot of, as well as there's also resistance elixirs and a lot of items that give you damage resistances as well. So there's just so many ways to get this effect that don't exist in tabletop that it is a much less valuable effect and much less worth spending your 4th level spell slot and your concentration on. It's just overshadowed by other options. It's a little worse for Stoneskin as well, because it only works on non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage, and in Baldur's Gate 3, almost all of the damage that you're taking by the time you get access to 4th level spells is going to be magical damage. In a tabletop campaign, that might not be true. You might still be facing enemies that do non-magical damage, but in Baldur's Gate 3, basically every late-game enemy's damage counts as magical. So Stoneskin, because of the specific context that it's in Baldur's Gate 3, is a pretty weak use of your spell slot, even though as a spell in and of itself, it's not terrible. I wouldn't necessarily fix this, although I do think that too many easy sources of resistance are kind of a structural problem with BG3, especially when you have played the game a few times and know where they all are. Especially the buff on heal items in the early game, I think are a little bit too strong, so I might tone those down a little. But honestly, changing Stoneskin I don't think is necessary, because the only thing that's holding it back is just the game context that it exists in. And getting into the top 10 list, starting at number 10, we have Compelled Duel. Compelled Duel is a level 1 spell that, for a bonus action and your concentration, forces an enemy to attack you and only you for 3 turns. Except it doesn't actually do that. The description of Compelled Duel, unfortunately, is incorrect. It says that the enemy has to only attack the caster, but the only part of this spell that they actually implemented was giving the enemy disadvantage on their attacks against people other than the caster. They're not forced to attack the caster, and if you move the caster out of range of them or whatever, they will just go ahead and happily attack your allies. This is unfortunate because this spell is still fairly expensive. It takes your concentration and a level 1 spell slot. So even though it only takes a bonus action to cast, giving an enemy disadvantage on some but not all of their attacks, because it's only disadvantage on people other than the caster, is just not really worth spending a level 1 spell slot on, especially because it has a wisdom save, and you can give enemies no save disadvantage with spells like Fog Cloud much more easily. This is also usually a paladin spell, and paladin level 1 spell slots are more expensive than other characters' level 1 spell slots because they get them later and have fewer of them and want to use them for smites. So spending a spell slot on Compelled Duel for a paladin is worse than spending it on Compelled Duel for another character. So really the issue with this spell is simply that it doesn't work. If the spell worked the way it was described and forced enemies to attack the caster, it would actually be pretty strong and very cool, and I think very fun to use. Casting Compelled Duel and then running away and forcing the enemy to chase after you would be an interesting strategy. Casting Compelled Duel and then forcing the enemy to attack a character with a bunch of retaliation damage, like an Abjuration Wizard with Compelled Duel, could be an interesting build, or a Warlock character that's using Hellish Rebuke could be a powerful option for Compelled Duel and could let you do some interesting builds. But the fact that this spell does not actually do what it says in the description makes it, unfortunately, not particularly good to use. The reason it's down here at number 10 instead of even worse, or higher up the list but lower down the list of quality, is that it still can be okay. Giving an enemy disadvantage for 3 turns if they try to attack your allies, or forcing them to attack a character like a paladin that they usually don't want to attack, is still not a totally useless effect. So even though the spell only has half of it implemented, you can still get some value out of it, but it's nowhere near as cool or interesting or powerful as if it actually did what it said in the description. Weighing in at number 9, Vampiric Touch. Vampiric Touch is a level 3 spell that you can concentrate on for up to 10 turns, and each turn you can make a melee attack, spell attack, that does 3d6 damage and heals you for half as many hit points as you deal in damage. The damage is necrotic, which means there's a lot of enemies in Baldur's Gate that resist it, though it does have some synergy with Death Cleric, which cares about necrotic damage, but mostly being necrotic damage is a disadvantage. The main problem with this spell is just that the numbers are awful. This is a level 3 spell that requires your concentration, so it's really, really expensive to use, and you have to compare it to other damage spells at this level, things like Lightning Bolt or Fireball that can deal huge amounts more damage to multiple enemies instead of 3d6 damage to one single target in melee range. Only dealing 3d6 damage, 1d6 per spell level that you use on this spell, is ridiculous. That is such an incredibly low amount, and even though it's repeatable, it's significantly worse most of the time than just using a cantrip or a weapon attack, just in terms of doing damage, and it obviously costs you your concentration and a level 3 spell slot in order to get this medium attack. Requiring your concentration is bad because it doesn't even give you the thing that could be useful for a spell like this is if it gave you a default action that you could take on your turn while concentrating on a more powerful spell. But since it takes your concentration, you can't combine it with a control spell and then run around vampiric touching things. That's not possible. So there just aren't really any cases where it's better to concentrate on this than a more powerful concentration spell, or better to use this for damage than a more powerful damaging spell. Fundamentally, the reason that this spell is weak is that in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, and thus in Baldur's Gate 3, the designers wildly overcosted healing. So a spell like this that does extremely weak damage and a tiny amount of healing is expensive because they wanted to make healing expensive. There's actually pretty good reasons for that. Dungeons & Dragons is supposed to be is intended as a tabletop game played in analog with your friends, and in tabletop, combats can take forever. If your friends are slow taking their turns, a single combat can easily last multiple hours. And so if healing is really strong, then that could take this problem of really long combats and extend it even further, which is why they made it so expensive. D&D is also a storytelling generator more than it is a tactical game, and it's much more dramatic and a much better story if you kill the boss while at the threshold of death, if you watch your hit points being taken away over time, and you just manage to land the killing blow with the last of your strength before they overcome you, than if you're just comfortably at full health the entire fight. So having healing be weak actually makes a lot of sense given the system that Baldur's Gate 3 is from. It just doesn't translate as well to a video game where a lot of those things aren't true, and you just end up with healing being a fairly weak strategy with weak numbers, with the exception of the buff on heal items, without any of the reasons that that's the case in tabletop. The easy fix for Vampiric Touch is just to improve the numbers. You could make this a level 2 spell, and it would still probably be pretty bad. You could make it do 5d6 damage and still heal for half, or you could make it do 3d6 and heal for the full amount. And then even then it would still be bad, but maybe with critical hits taken into account and with specific strategies built around it, it could be a little more interesting, simply if the numbers were better. As is, even in the best case scenario, you're going to never outpace enemy damage with the healing that this gives you, and you'll be dealing less damage than you would by casting other spells. Also, a spell that requires you to maintain concentration on it in order to have sort of sustain over longer fights is pretty contradictory, because if you're up front taking damage to make the healing from Vampiric Touch worth using, then you're going to drop concentration on Vampiric Touch and not be able to use it anyways. So this could probably be a lower level spell. It could probably not be concentration. There's a lot of tweaks that you could make, but fundamentally the numbers on this spell just too small. Coming in at number 8, another casualty of Baldur's Gate 3 being a video game, Animal Friendship. Animal Friendship is basically charm person for animals. It makes an animal think that you are its friend. And in tabletop D&D, that's actually a pretty useful tool. You can do things like quiet down a guard dog so you can sneak into a guarded compound, or convince an injured wild animal that you're there to heal it rather than hurt it further. And those are all things that can really come up in tabletop D&D and be really interesting storytelling with Animal Friendship. That doesn't really exist in Baldur's Gate 3. Those scenarios don't come up, and the times that they do, it usually can easily be cleared with other skill checks like animal handling, or with Speak with Animals, which solves pretty much every encounter that you have with animals in the game, and is a ritual spell that's also available for free from extremely plentiful potions. So Animal Friendship is mostly just duplicated by things that don't cost you a spell slot when you use it outside of combat. In combat, charm doesn't really work that well in Baldur's Gate 3 because it only prevents the animal from attacking the caster, so it's just going to go ahead and attack your party members anyways. So it's a pretty weak use of a spell slot in combat, and out of combat it's simply duplicated by other things. To fix this spell, honestly, it's not really necessary to fix it, because this spell is one that is really cool in tabletop, but doesn't really have a particular niche in Baldur's Gate 3. But you could have it be an alternative solution to some of the encounters that you have with animals if you made it a ritual spell. That way you could have Animal Friendship or Speak with Animals as options outside of combat, available to different classes and stuff like that. So that could be a more interesting way for it to be integrated into Baldur's Gate 3's spellcasting options. But frankly, the things that this spell does are covered pretty well by animal handling and speak with animals and other skill checks that the game gives you to cover animal encounters or encounters with beasts. So I don't think it's that necessary that you have this somewhat redundant option, because the things that make this spell different than those things, the scenarios where you would want animal friendship over speak with animals or the animal handling skill, don't really exist in Baldur's Gate 3. And a very similar spell coming in at number 7, Dominate Beast. So just like there's Charm Person and Dominate Person, there's also Animal Friendship and Dominate Beast. And for the same reason that Animal Friendship is relatively weak, Dominate Beast is pretty weak in Baldur's Gate 3 as well, because there simply aren't that many beast encounters where dominating one of them is actually good. By the time you get access to this spell, you've completed most of the dangerous beast encounters in the game, though there is one Act 3 encounter where this can be okay, which is why it doesn't show up even further down the list. But there just are very few beast fights where you would actually want to cast this. And even when you do, it's actually not that good. Because the creature gets a new save against this spell every single time it takes damage, and because beasts tend to have low armor class, enemies will often direct their attacks against them. You're often basically spending this spell to cost one enemy one turn, and then it just gets hit and breaks out of this spell effect and goes back to fighting against you. So Dominate Beast tends not to be very good because it takes your concentration, takes a level 4 spell slot, and while if it works perfectly, it can be an okay effect, most of the time it's not going to work perfectly, and you can get the same results much more powerfully with more generally applicable control spells. Compare this to Hypnotic Pattern, which just takes all of the enemies out of the fight for a level 3 spell slot, and you can see why you're usually not going to want to use this. There is one Act 3 encounter where Dominate Beast is not bad, because the numbers are against you in that encounter, and this can give you some leeway. But overall, this is just not a spell that you're going to end up using very frequently, because the effect isn't great, and it's just rarely applicable. Now, it's worth noting for Dominate Beast, and I included a little note here, that there is a severe bug with this spell that can make it absolutely broken. Combining various spell effects and buggy manipulation of what characters are in and out of your party and fast travel and stuff. You can use Dominate Beast to turn enemies into permanent followers. And obviously, if you're doing that, if you're using that bug, then it's a broken effect. But outside of that fairly extreme exploit, you usually shouldn't cast this spell. Again, the fix for this is just to make it relevant in more encounters. If there were more late-game beast fights, it might be a different story. Dominate Person is also a fairly weak spell, but there's a lot of fights against humanoids, so you can use Dominate Person in those and get some value out of it. Dominate Beast is just the same thing that comes up significantly less, so if there were more beast fights, maybe it would be a little better, but I don't think you actually need to change the spell. Starting at number 6 is where we start to get to the spells that are really, really not good, and the first one of these is Enthrall. Enthrall is a level 2 spell that makes a character look at you. For up to 10 turns, they just have to turn and look at you, and that's all that the spell does. It costs you a level 2 spell slot. This is effectively a worse version of the cantrip Minor Illusion, because it has a wisdom saving throw, and has only affects one target instead of affecting every creature in the area. So Enthrall can't be used to pull enemies away from their allies or group enemies up for an AoE spell effect when they all run after the cat and then get blown up by a fireball. It just can be used to maybe steal stuff or interrupt NPCs who are searching for you, because the way that this spell is supposed to work is it's supposed to stop NPCs from thinking that you've committed a crime, either by stopping them from looking at you while you commit it, or by enthralling them so that they cease searching for you. The problem is that this function doesn't actually work, and even if it did, it would still be worse than just using Minor Illusion, hiding, and Fog Cloud to prevent them from seeing you in the first place. But you have to have very precise timing because it only interrupts their search cycle if they are in the middle of yelling that you've committed a crime. If you cast Enthrall too early, they'll still search for who committed the crime. If you cast it too late and when they're already searching, then they will still keep searching during and after the duration of Enthrall. So this spell mostly doesn't work. Baldur's Gate 3's crime mechanics are already pretty buggy, and adding in an unreliable and buggy spell in order to try to circumvent them is really not where you want to be. The way to fix this spell would be to make it a ritual spell, or maybe even a cantrip. Enthrall is, again, another spell that's fairly interesting in tabletop, although even then there are better ways to distract people than spending a level 2 spell slot on it. But in Baldur's Gate 3, there are just way easier ways to manipulate where enemies are standing and where they are looking, and spending resources on that is simply never going to be valuable, so the only way that you could fix this spell is to make it free. And getting into the top, or bottom, depending on how you want to look at it, 5 worst spells in Baldur's Gate 3. Coming in at number 5, we have Harm. Harm is a level 6 spell that does damage. It is a 60-foot range Constitution save, where enemies take half damage if they succeed the save. And it does 14d6 necrotic damage, but can never reduce enemy hit points below 1. The gimmick of this spell is that it reduces enemy maximum health. So if they fail the saving throw, then it actually reduces their max health, and so they won't be able to heal back over that hit point total. But of course in Baldur's Gate 3, most of the enemies that heal are undead or resistant to necrotic damage, and so won't be affected by this spell at all. This also counts as a disease, the effect of Harm, and lots of enemies are immune to disease, so most of the time the hit point reduction effect simply won't actually function. Why is this spell bad? I mean, it's a level 6 damage spell. It's a damage spell that can't kill stuff. You cast damage spells to kill things, and Harm doesn't do that. And the maximum hit point reduction effect most of the time doesn't function. If the enemy fails the saving throw, also, it will not... because it bypasses the normal way that things do damage and instead reduces enemy maximum hit points, then it ignores a lot of on-hit effects and normal ways to bypass necrotic resistance. So if enemies fail the save, often they get more resistances and take less damage than if they succeed against the save, where they take 14d6 damage halved normally, but it's normal necrotic damage, so the on-hit effects work. So there's a lot of bugs that make this spell significantly less effective than it's supposed to be, and even if it worked perfectly, conceptually, a damage spell that can't kill stuff, not a good spell. I mean, that's obviously ridiculous on the face of it. The numbers on this spell are also pretty bad. 14d6 damage for a level 6 spell slot is significantly worse than basically every other damage spell at this level. Compare it to the 10d8 that you get from Chain Lightning, but that's across 4 targets, and can be doubled with the wet condition and so on. And you can see that Harm as a single target damage spell just simply does not do enough damage to make it worth casting, even if it could actually kill things. The way that you would fix this spell, of course, would be to allow it to kill things, to improve the numbers so that it was worth spending your 6th level spell slot on, to fix the numerous bugs that this spell has. But an important thing about Harm, and why I think it's not terrible that it's a really bad spell, is that this is a spell that's not really designed to be cast by players. Reducing your maximum hit points is something that we don't really care about when you're using it on an enemy, because in basically any situation where you're fighting an enemy, either you have lost the game at the end of it, or that enemy is dead. So enemy maximum hit points simply don't matter. But if an enemy casts Harm on you and reduces your maximum hit points, especially in a tabletop game where that could be at a critical moment where you then don't have time to go get that fixed or something like that, that can be a terrifying and devastating event to have happen. So this spell is much more intended, and the rules for this spell exist in the game, for enemies to cast it on players more than for players to use it. So I don't think it's actually a problem that this spell is awful, that the rate is really bad, because it's intended to be something to strike fear into the hearts of player characters, not to be an effective tool in combat. In that way, it's very similar to Circle of Death, which doesn't make the list, but is also a very bad spell, because Circle of Death is intended to be used by an evil enemy to blow up like an entire village and show how evil they are, rather than to be an effective tool in the hands of players. Harm is very similar to that, where it's a storytelling and tension-raising device more than it is a game piece in the game of Baldur's Gate 3. Coming in at number 4, Windwalk. So Windwalk basically lets you cast Gaseous Form on your whole party. So you're using a level 6 spell slot in order to cast a level 3 effect on your whole party. And obviously duplicating a lower level effect with a higher level spell slot is always going to be expensive on rate. And again, this is a level 6 spell slot, so this is pretty much your most important resource in the game that you're using to do something that normally takes a level 3 spell slot to use. The advantage is that you can do it on your whole party, which means that you can traverse all of your party members through areas that you would want to be in gaseous form in order to get to. But most of the time when you're trying to use gaseous form, you only really need one character to be in the gaseous form to scout ahead or to do the tricks that you can do by passing through grates or out over lakes of lava, stuff like that. There are some interesting tricks you can do with gaseous form, but most of the time you only need one character in the gaseous form in order to do that, and you can get that for a level 3 spell slot where it's already expensive, or a potion, which is the way that you're most likely to actually use this effect. Windwalk simply doesn't have too many encounters where it's going to come up, and it's extraordinarily expensive to use. There are vastly better ways, especially by the time you get to level 6 spells, to get the out-of-combat traversal that this spell is intended for, and so casting Windwalk is almost always going to be a waste of the most important thing that your party is doing, casting level 6 spells. The reason that this spell is so bad is simply that it's not intended to do something that Baldur's Gate 3 has. This in tabletop D&D is an overland travel spell because it lasts all day and lets you fly really, really fast, so you can move at like 50 miles an hour overland when your party is in Windwalk, which in a lot of tabletop settings and fantasy worlds, that's actually very relevant. This spell can be used for overland fast travel in order to warn the lord of a keep that the orcish army is approaching before they get there, or interrupt the lich's ritual before the last piece is in place for them to achieve ascension to godhood. There's lots of times where you might want to be able to travel overland quickly in a tabletop campaign, but in Baldur's Gate 3 there's a fast travel map, so you simply don't ever need to cast Windwalk. I don't think that they need to fix this spell. It just does something, like, it's implemented because it's cool, and you can have fun with it, and I will say that this spell is really fun to play with. Turning your whole party into clouds lets you just sort of fart around Baldur's Gate and get into very weird locations, and that can be very, very fun. But the thing that this spell is really intended for simply doesn't exist in the video game, and so I don't think that they need to change it. It was easy to implement because they just used mechanics that they had already implemented for gaseous form, and it lets you have fun. It just doesn't need to be that good. And in third place, Phantasmal Force. Phantasmal Force is a very disappointing spell to me. I really feel sad every time I look at this spell because it's such a cool spell in tabletop, and they only implemented a tiny fraction of the spell in Baldur's Gate. In a game where they honestly did such a good job of implementing, especially things like illusions and enchantments that are really difficult to make work in a video game, this stands out as a pretty glaring omission where they didn't manage to get a spell working that is a really cool spell in tabletop. In BG3, it's a single target concentration damage spell, so you use your concentration, cast it on a single enemy. They make an intelligence saving throw, and if they fail, they take 1d6 damage every turn. That's it. It does 1d6 damage every turn for a level 2 spell slot. That is probably the worst damage to spell slot ratio available in the game, even worse than things like Vampiric Touch, because that amount of damage is just so ridiculously tiny. It's not worth spending your spell slot on, it's not worth spending your concentration on. It will never, ever impact a combat in any meaningful way, so it's simply just not worth wasting your time on. It's really expensive, your concentration's valuable, your level 2 spell slots are valuable, and so the fact that it only does 1d6 damage is just kind of an insult, and every time I look at this spell, it just makes me sad to think about how cool it is in tabletop and how weak it is in Baldur's Gate. Speaking of tabletop, how it works in tabletop is that it still does damage and still is a single target concentration spell with an intelligence save. Only it does 2d8 damage, so for some reason, while also removing the main effect of this spell entirely, they also decided to reduce the damage by more than 50%, just a bizarre decision. But in addition to that, the way that it works is it makes the creature that you target with it believe that what they're seeing is real. This is a very powerful control effect, especially in the hands of creative players. You can make an enemy believe that they're being chased by a demon, or that the room they're in is on fire, or that they're pinned down under a heavy beam, or that they are sinking into the ground in quicksand. And then the creature will react to that image accordingly. With creative usage of this spell and images that you're putting into enemies' heads, you can use this as an extremely dangerous control effect. An enemy who thinks they're pinned down under a heavy beam will not be attacking you, they'll be trying to push the beam off of themselves. And so you can use this to lock down an enemy. That's what makes this spell actually good, is that it's a control spell, not that it's a weak damage over time spell. And the fact that they completely removed that component of the spell is just kind of bizarre, especially because they already pre-programmed the modes for command. You could just use those. If Phantasmal Force just had the 5 options that command has, and then those just lasted as long as you concentrated on the spell, this would be an interesting alternative to a spell like Hold Person. It would work on one enemy at a time, and couldn't be upcast to hit multiple enemies and stuff like that. But in exchange for being a weaker effect, the enemy wouldn't be taking automatic critical hits. It would work on more targets because it's an intelligence save, so you could target creatures with weak intelligence saves and deal a little damage over time. That would make it an interesting spell in the arsenal of a spellcaster, while not being wildly overpowered. As is, this spell unfortunately doesn't do anything, so since they, I mean, the only real fix is just to finish implementing the spell. But what could be even worse than that? Coming in at number 2, Dispel Evil and Good. Now, it's very likely, I think, that most of you don't remember that this spell exists at all because it's so rarely discussed. Dispel Evil and Good is basically protection from evil and good, except at level 5 instead of at level 1, and it only lasts for 10 turns instead of lasting all day. So it is a vastly worse version of a level 1 spell that costs your 5th level spell slot. It makes certain types of creatures, so aberrations, celestials, elementals, fae, fiends, and undead, have disadvantage on attack rolls against you, except it doesn't work on aberrations, which are the most common of this type of creature by the time you have 5th level spell slots. And so you don't get any protection against some of the most dangerous enemies that you might want to use this spell for. You can also only use it on yourself, and can't cast it on allies, which you can with protection from evil and good. And so you're getting, for 10 turns, a worse, buggier, and weaker version of a 1st level spell at the cost of a 5th level spell slot. I mean, I know I keep repeating this phrase, it's a worse version of a level 1 spell, but it really bears repeating just how ridiculous it is to spend a 5th level spell slot on this significantly worse version of a level 1 effect, and then get a bunch of bonus bugs in addition to that. The other thing that you get in addition to Dispel Evil and Good is the Break Enchantment action, which lets you, in addition to the Protection from Evil and Good effect, is the Break Enchantments action. So this lets you spend your action in order to snap an ally out of Charm, Frighten, or Possess effects. Except again, this is very buggy. So even if this was a good use of your action, which in most encounters it's not, and usually isn't going to be a good trade, especially because in Baldur's Gate 3, making your allies immune to those conditions also snaps them out of it. So you could just use that action to cast Protection from Evil or Calm Emotions or something and snap them out of those effects. So even if you were in an encounter where you wanted to repeatedly break enemies out of those effects, you could do that for much cheaper, or you could simply make them immune to them in the first place. And then even if you do use break enchantment, it again is buggy and doesn't work. It will not break allies out of all fear effects, only specifically the frightened condition, which is a very small subset of the fear effects in the game. Possession mostly doesn't happen, and I think the two cases where you can have possessed effects in the game, break enchantment doesn't work on breaking you out of them. So this spell not only is bad conceptually, it's also implemented in such a way that it simply doesn't function. The way to fix this spell, I mean, really, from a conceptual standpoint, I don't really know why this spell exists at all. Protection from Evil and Good already does this thing, but better. But if you want to have a better version of that, then it should certainly last all day, because you're spending a higher level spell slot on the same effect, and probably be a lower level spell slot. The break enchantment action would be kind of interesting, maybe, if this was like a third level spell, then you could use this as an alternative to things like Hero's Feast to give your allies frightened immunity, and then if they got frightened, you could break them out of it with break enchantment on a support character. If this was cheaper and lasted all day, but since it's not, it's absolutely never worth casting. But what's even worse than spending a 5th level spell slot for a level 1 spell effect? Spending a 5th level spell slot for a level 1 ritual spell effect. Enter Seeming. Seeming is a 5th level spell that duplicates the effect of Disguise Self on your whole party instead of just on one character. But Disguise Self is a ritual spell, so Seeming is costing you a 5th level spell slot in order to do something that is almost always free. The reason that this isn't more powerful, because you could imagine that disguising multiple party members would actually be something useful, is that Baldur's Gate 3 just doesn't care about having more than one party member disguised. Because of the way that conversations work in Baldur's Gate 3, you only have one character involved in conversation at a time. And so disguising multiple party members isn't something that you ever have to do. You only need to disguise your main character in order to get all of the benefits out of disguising. Disguise Self is free, so you simply don't need Seeming in order to disguise your allies, because that just never comes up. Even in the cases where you might imagine it would come up, like there are a couple conversations where, for example, having a certain party member in your party changes the outcome of that conversation, or where you're trying to break an NPC out of jail and you could imagine disguising them as someone else in order to get them out freely. That doesn't work. Enemies just see through the seeming. So if you have Shadowheart in the conversation where someone recognizes Shadowheart, even if she's disguised, you still get the dialogue for recognizing Shadowheart. So seeming just doesn't work in those cases. Because of the somewhat weird way that Baldur's Gate 3 implemented conversation, where only one character is actually in the conversation at a time, so you could never have a party member weigh in or make skill checks for you or anything like that, even though theoretically they're standing right there. Bit of a pet peeve of mine, but that's besides the point. Seeming just never comes up because you only need to disguise one character at a time, so a spell that disguises multiples is fairly pointless. And for the things that you might think it's not pointless for, it doesn't function, so you shouldn't use this spell. There are a couple uses for Scrolls of Seeming that are okay. You can use it to shrink your entire party in one button click. So if you have a Scroll of Seeming, it can save you some clicks compared to shrinking your party members one by one with other effects, in order to fit them all through one of the gaps that you need to be a small party to fit through. So that is one option for a Scroll of Seeming. And you can use it to gain the racial benefits of certain weapons without having to have that character know Disguise Self, because if they're disguised as a member of that race, they can gain the benefits of those weapons, and if you disguise them and then later remove the disguise, they keep the benefits, so you can use a Scroll of Seeming for that, but you should never cast this spell, because it's super expensive and doesn't really do anything that you can't get completely for free. How would you fix this spell? Honestly, I mean, other than implementing a check to see if characters are disguised when NPCs recognize them. Obviously, it should work for that, because you would expect it to work for that, so that would be a reasonable bug fix to take. You simply can't fix this spell without completely overhauling the dialogue system in Baldur's Gate 3. It solves a problem that doesn't exist in a game where your party members cease to exist when you enter conversations. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this list of the worst 10 spells in Baldur's Gate 3, plus an honorable mention. Obviously, like I said, don't take this list too seriously for your play. If you're enjoying casting these spells, or if you're finding them useful, definitely keep doing that. I do not want you to stop casting spells that you're finding fun or powerful. And obviously, the game works really well with the way that the spells are balanced currently, so although there could be some fixes that maybe improve these spells and make them see more play, it's obviously not necessary for that to be the case. In fact, I think one of the neat things about compiling this list has been how many of these spells are bad simply because they are implementations of a spell that makes sense in tabletop but doesn't really make sense in a video game. And so something like Seeming or Windwalk are cool spells that I'm glad they put in the game, because it's just cool that they're there. More options is always more fun in a game like this that's about doing cool things and trying interesting solutions to problems. And the fact that these spells are intended to solve a type of encounter that doesn't exist in the video game Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't mean that they shouldn't exist in the game. So I think it's kind of neat that so many of the worst spells in the game fall into that category rather than sheer mistakes in balancing, although a couple of them, like Vampiric Touch, are definitely that as well. As always, of course, if you disagree with any of these placements or think I missed any really garbage spells that deserve to be on the list over some of the ones I've included, or if you think I've missed some uses for the spells on this list that make them better than I think they are, definitely let me know in the comments. And of course, if you've enjoyed the video, feel free to leave any comment. It helps me out with the algorithm, and also hitting like on the video will help me out, so I appreciate you taking the time to do that. Of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 and other strategy game analysis, and I will catch you next time.